Welcome to Failing Forward, where our motto is learn to fail and you'll finally succeed. My name is Nick, and I'm here with my co host Harris. And last week we covered our Sentinel project, which is a robot where we had to do a competition. We were trying to get to Germany. You should give it a listen, it was pretty interesting. But we found that our major failure in that project was actually a failure to communicate. And we're going to continue that theme into this episode, where a failure to communicate doesn't just lose you a competition, it can actually lose you some lives. It can kill people. So today we're going to talk about the NASA Columbia shuttle failure. Harris has done some research, and we're going to talk about how the failure happened, and then we're going to move on to what can we learn from this, and honestly, what have we learned from this? Because companies like Amazon, Tesla, and SpaceX, they use some pretty interesting communication techniques internal to their companies, and we're just going to go ahead and talk through what they're doing and our thoughts on it. So, Harris, where would you like to start?
So I think let's just start with kind of an explanation of what happened on the Columbia mission, because it was a long time ago. Not everybody will kind of know what that was, and it was a very long time ago. So let's dive into that.
I
Um,
definitely don't
yeah,
know what it is. No research
yes,
beforehand.
I did some research because I love space, and so looking at all these missions and
Mhm.
seeing which ones worked and which ones didn't, and more importantly, why they didn't, is always very interesting to me. So Space Shuttle Columbia. So in 2003, NASA launches this shuttle, and the mission was, pretty standard. It was mostly scientific. So what they wanted to do was study the effects of microgravity on the human body and on various different bacteria and insects and that kind of thing. So they took some moss, they took some roundworms, and a bunch of other stuff, and they were just doing a bunch of tests to see what would happen, would they survive, and what kind of implications this has for surviving extended trips in deep space. And so they send the shuttle up there, and what happens is about 82 seconds after the launch, a piece of foam that's 1.6 pounds breaks off from the liquid fuel tank, hits the left wing, and flies off. So
Hmm.
it's not, I mean, this might seem concerning. And the mission is going to go for 16 days. So this shuttle takes off and everything is normal except for this piece of insulation that broke off and shattered and hit into the left wing. Now,
Can I ask a question?
yes,
So you said a piece of foam,
yes,
1.6 pounds. Like,
yes.
there's a lot of different foams. This was it like squishy foam? Was it really, really dense? Like,
Uh,
this was
yeah,
insulation? It was like heat? What was it for?
it's insulated. It's meant to protect it from the extreme heat when you launch and when you come back to Earth. So it's a pretty hefty piece of foam,
Okay.
pretty
Yeah.
dense.
Yeah. 1.6 pounds of foam. That's like saying a pound of feathers. But I get
A
it.
one
It's insulation, good insulation.
1 pound, but you also have to remember this thing is flying at like 5 times the speed of sound, so it's
Oh, yeah.
flying really fast. So a small weight hitting it at any speed like that is
Yeah.
going to impact it a lot.
Wow. Okay.
Um, So Columbia safely makes it to orbit and begins its experiments. They take their worms, they take the moss, they start doing their thing. Now, there's a protocol that NASA has to follow. There's some staff and some specialized people go and they review footage from a conveniently placed camera that captured the foam debris hitting the wing. Now, if that seems too convenient to you, this is standard protocol.
Conspiracy?
No, the camera was placed there because this same thing happened on 4 previous missions. Um,
Oh,
Now,
okay.
there's a whole protocol they have to go through to make sure that the wing is okay for re-entry or if there's any other work that needs to be done.
Mhm.
So they go through this video, but I need to remind you that it's 2003. So the video that they're looking at isn't
Mhm.
great. And there's a full report on this that we'll link in the podcast description. But
Mhm.
in this report, there's 2 still frames where you see like a white blur, and that white blur is the foam piece hitting the wing. So it's kind of miraculous that they
Yeah.
even caught this thing.
It's like a
And
UFO sighting.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh yeah, that star it must be like a flying saucer. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, so they're now, they're in orbit, and the question is, will they be okay on re-entry or will they not be? So they assemble a team of Boeing engineers, which is a term that in 2024 has
Oh
aged
no.
very, very well. Although I do want to point out that them being Boeing had nothing to do with the rest of the story, but it's kind of funny because it's 2024 and Boeing
I
is
knowing what it
hot
is now, I
water.
think it had something to do with what happened.
So
Um, they didn't get bad until like 2010, I think I heard. So
yeah,
yeah,
this is before the dark times for Boeing.
yeah.
But the Boeing engineers prepared 3 reports, and those reports had 28 PowerPoint slides on them. And the main slide that I want to discuss is a very innocent looking slide. And it's kind of
Mm,
hard to talk about a PowerPoint slide on a podcast, but I'll do my best. Um,
oh,
so it was a white background, default black font,
mhm,
8 bullet points. And
mm.
imagine each bullet point is filled with short sentences that have dense technical language. The
What if
title of the
you
slide. Go ahead.
present the slide to us? Like just present it. We can't see it, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
just
like
do it as if you were the person. Yeah, that would be
uh,
good.
let
Or
me
just
pull
read
it
off
up.
the slide. I don't know.
Let me pull it up. Uh, Columbia. Yeah, but this slide was kind of incredible, and this is what I want to spend most of this podcast
Mhm.
talking about. Uh, Slide. Oh, you caught me off guard. At all this research. I didn't know I'd be reading the PowerPoint slide. Well done. Well done. Okay. So, okay, here's the slide. Title: Review of test data indicates conservatism for tile penetration.
Wow.
First
Okay.
bullet. Yeah, I mean, you
I
know what I'm
won't
talking
interrupt.
about right
I'm in
away.
the audience. I'm just
Yeah,
like, what the hell did this guy just say?
yeah.
Okay.
So, main bullet: the existing SOFI on tile test data used to create Crater was reviewed along with STS-87 Southwest research data. The crater overpredicted the penetration of the tile coating significantly. The initial penetration is to be described by its normal velocity, which varies with the volume and mass of the projectile. For example, 200 feet per second for 3 cubic units. Significant energy is required for the softer SOFI particle to penetrate the relatively hard tile coating. The test results do show that it is possible at sufficient mass and velocity. Conversely, once the tile is penetrated, SOFI can cause significant damage. Minor variations in total energy can cause significant tile damage. The flight condition is significantly outside of the test database. The volume of the ramp is 1,920 cubic units versus 3 cubic units for the test. So that's the slide. I also want to point out
Oh
there's a
my
typo.
god.
They misspelled hard as HANRD. So that's fun.
Standard.
Now, anyways,
Oh
this is the first
man.
time you've heard this slide, and I'm very curious what you took away from my quick reading of it.
I don't even what the hell is Sophie? That's the only thing I have to ask because I don't remember what else you said. You said something about cubic feet or meters and
Yes.
penetrating. I just got caught up on the whole thing of Sophie. Like I don't even know what that
Yes.
acronym is. Maybe they were supposed to know that acronym. So that's outside. But even if I was hearing like conversely or
Hmm.
conservationally, like impact.
Conservatism.
Yeah, like all these
Yeah.
words are they're not speaking words, they're reading words.
Correct.
And I was trying to visualize myself reading it, but it was a battle was happening in my brain trying to listen to you say this. I was like blinking my eyes, looking upwards,
Yes.
trying
Yes.
to think, how can I understand what he's saying?
Hmm.
Like I was trying really hard. I'm trying really hard. I don't even know if our listeners will try as hard as I did to understand what you just said.
Correct. So I can
So
answer a
that's
few questions for
okay,
you.
go ahead.
SOFI is the acronym that refers to the foam. So anytime they talk about
Okay.
SOFI, they're talking about the foam. But also,
Okay.
the word ramp also refers
Right.
to the foam. So it's
Ramp
kind of
was yeah.
weird.
I was hearing ramp a lot and I was thinking what ramp? What cuz like it hit a there's foam that hit a wing
Yes.
and this PowerPoint is about that occurrence.
Correct.
and they're talking about energy, and they were giving you way too much information about how much energy it needed, what
Hmm.
speeds, and
Yep.
yeah, it seemed like I didn't have any takeaway from it.
Yeah.
I didn't know what the whole point of that slide was. They
Correct.
said a bunch of things, but I'm confused.
Yep.
So please
S-
deconfuse me.
So
Defuse my confusion.
I'm very glad that you said that because exactly how you reacted is how most management reacted to. Because you've also got to remember that the way this was delivered was as a report that was consisting of PowerPoint slides. So,
Mm,
to the best of my knowledge, I don't think it was actually presented. I kind of imagined this as an email attachment, and
yeah.
some manager just read this and basically said, "Looks good to me," and then passed it on to
Mhm,
their higher up, and so on and so forth. And their
mhm,
conclusion after this initial report was that Columbia was safe and they didn't have to do any additional work for a safe landing. Now, engineers are engineers, and they didn't really buy that. And they
mhm,
said, okay, you've made your conclusion, and so has upper management. But at least let the military use some high resolution spy cameras to
mhm,
photograph the wing. We don't have that cameras. Apparently, NASA doesn't have it, but the military does. So they're like, hey,
mm,
let's just ask them. Let's take a picture, take a video. I think it was a picture. So like, if we take a picture, we can confirm whether or not there's a hole in the wing, which would be catastrophic.
mm.
And they got dismissed. They said, due to the report that you wrote, we don't need to do this. So we're not going to waste the resources
Interesting.
and let them finish the mission, right?
Yeah.
So the shuttle orbits for 2 weeks, and it's doing its thing. They finished experiments. They're ready for a safe landing.
Mhm.
Saturday, February 1st, 2003. Columbia is scheduled to land at 9:16 Eastern Standard Time. Um, right before 9 o'clock, just 60,000 meters above the landing site, running at
Mm.
running at 18 times the speed of sound. All of a sudden, the temperature readings on the shuttle begin to read abnormally high.
Oh no.
Then, momentarily later, all readings are lost with the ground crew. No communication at all. At 9:12, when Columbia should have been approaching the runway, the shuttle disintegrates and kills all 7 astronauts on board. During the intense heat of re-entry, hot gases most likely penetrated the interior of the wing through that hole that was formed from the foam hitting it, which compromised the hydraulic system, leading to control failure of the control surfaces.
Oh
No
man.
control means it can't do anything, and the dynamic pressures inside the shuttle led to the vehicle breaking up. Everybody passes away. Afterwards, the space shuttle program is on complete lockdown for 2 years as investigations
Wow.
begin. Of course, there's a lot of questions, but the big one, probably the most important one, is why did NASA proceed with re-entry when the foam
Mhm.
stuck the tile at such a massive force, causing a hole, which eventually led to the deaths of everybody on board, right?
Yeah.
So
Wow.
I think, given everything I've said, you probably have a good guess at the answer, right?
Oh yeah. Well, it's probably about communication, but
Yes.
I just want to. Wow, just hearing about the experience that they had before during that re-entry, that must have been really scary. The
Hmm.
podcast isn't about that experience, but I mean, yeah, it's really easy to hear about a tragedy, especially nowadays where we've had a lot more tragedies that are
Hmm.
also like we have one every week pretty much. But yeah, just thinking about this where such a simple mistake from in judgment from management of saying no, we don't need to do anything special. Just that alone, saying yes or no to a simple question,
Hmm.
that caused like very, I mean, that's tortuous,
Hmm.
torturous, very bad.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
I'm astounded.
one thing that's always fascinated me is the butterfly effect, and this is probably one of the most
Mm,
morbid applications of that because you think about
yeah.
one exec or multiple execs signing off on
Hmm.
this decision, and it eventually leads to deaths, which is I don't know how you'd feel having that on your conscience, but that would be horrible, right?
Yeah. And I'm sure, I mean, NASA is not the most exciting job, probably. At least, like, the day to day is probably not very high octane, doing stuff every time, doing new things. Like,
Yeah.
it's a cool job, but it sounds like it's very bureaucratic. So I can imagine the upper management being also very every day is the same or very
Mhm.
similar. So it's very easy to get a crappy report, sign off on it because that's what you do every day. I've
Yep.
never been in management, so I don't know, but I get the feeling like it's easy to kind of get into a rut and just continue without thinking about what's happening or
Mhm.
what you're reading. And it's more of like, we're just going to do it like we've always done it type of mentality.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it seems like that also might have been it, but continue.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of people like to, because their brains are simple, right? So it's easier to point at
Mhm.
one person or one reason to be like, this was the
Mhm.
main thing why. But usually, when something like this happens, it's more of like a systemic problem where there's
Yeah.
a accumulation of bad things that led to this hugely terrible thing to happen.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so with that, we should have a brief digression about PowerPoint because
Mhm.
I think, and I didn't even realize this until I was kind of researching the story, but yeah,
Mhm.
PowerPoint is one of those tools that we are just when we're young, we're taught to use. I guess
Yeah.
I'll say the majority of people, no matter what domain they end up going into, at some point in elementary school and probably high school, they will make a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
And
Nowadays they will. Yeah.
yes, some of them are good, some of them are, or most of them are terrible,
Mhm.
but that's kind of the main thing that people kind of learn to quickly inform an audience or educate an
Mhm.
audience, right? And this has permeated its way into business too. So usually, if you have an idea, you need to explain it to multiple people. PowerPoint is the way you go. Now,
Right.
depending on the environment you're in, like if you're in more academia, or if you're in a more a very strict environment, you might need to do reports and stuff. But usually,
Right.
that's reserved for a very specific audience. And if you hand someone a study or a paper or a report, they probably won't read it, but PowerPoint has a higher visibility because there's less on the slide, for better or for worse,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah, very true.
yep. So there's this guy. I shouldn't call him a guy. He's a Yale professor. But
Right.
there's this professor at Yale named Edward Tufte, and
Mm.
he's an expert in communications. So
Mhm.
he looked at these reports that the engineers made. And by reports, I mean PowerPoint slides.
Mhm.
And the one that he ripped to shreds was that one that I just recited for you
Oh,
on the
yeah.
podcast. Um, and his analysis is pretty good, but I also think it's pretty obvious. Like,
Right.
for example, one of the main things he picks on is the main title, which is centered in the largest font,
Mhm.
gives a false sense of confidence, and it causes the main point to be lost immediately.
Yeah.
And he also points out some psychological things, like in PowerPoint, nested bullet points lead to each nested bullet point having a smaller font size than the main bullet points.
Mhm.
And this also implies to people that sentences in smaller fonts are less important than the sentences in the larger fonts.
Exactly.
And the engineers placed the sentence in the smallest font that was the most important.
Mhm.
Might seem dumb, but I actually kind of understand why they might have done that because if you're constructing your slide from a perspective of first principles, where you start with your big
Mhm.
idea, break it down, build up off of that to get your next point to your next point, and then finally to your conclusion, that kind of naturally follows what bullet points do. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Could I
Yes.
say the thought? So it's yeah, the biggest idea was like you need this velocity, this impact velocity, or like a high enough impact velocity will break the wing. The second bullet point, which comes from that idea, is your next one and gets a smaller font because that's how PowerPoint does it. Then you say it impacted at this velocity. And then the next point is like another third bullet point that's even smaller, which is like because of that, it broke. basically.
Yes.
Like that's kind of their ideas. You have a big idea of what you start out with, and then they just gradually go downwards.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah. And
It's
again,
very engineering thinking. It's an engineer thought
yeah,
process.
I don't know if I fault them for that because again, I've done that in my own PowerPoints before too. Because that's
Yeah.
you kind of put the punchline at the bottom and build your way up to it, right?
And
Now,
it was a report. So like you said, they weren't going to present it. It was more of a PowerPoint slide that's being as a report. So
yes,
the formatting is automatic, but that kind of screws them over because if it was a regular report, maybe they would have written it in the abstract that gave the key. But even with
yep,
the main title messed up, I don't know.
yeah, and yeah. So I want to touch on that point. The sentence in the smallest font was the most important because you've probably already forgotten what that sentence was.
I have no idea. I was really struggling to give the example because I don't remember what they said.
Yes. So the sentence was flight condition is significantly outside of the test database. The volume
Oh,
of ramp is 1920 cubic inches versus 3 cubic inches for the test. Now, when I highlight
oh,
it and I say it like that, now you're starting to understand why that's the main point of the slide, right?
yeah. But
Yes.
can I simplify what was just said even? Because
Yes.
even that sentence confused me.
Hmm.
Like, because it said something about what was? Could you say the first sentence again? Because you have it in front of you.
Flight condition is significantly outside of test database.
Okay, that terminology is very vague, where it's not very conversational. Like if, and even if you read that, it wouldn't immediately give you the idea of like what. So what's the problem?
Mhm.
It's telling you what the truth is, but it's not telling you why it's bad or if it's good. There's no opinion in that sentence. It just says a fact, which is
Yes.
what we experienced was not tested before. But even
Correct.
what I said is still leaning a little bit towards saying, "Hey, this is not a good thing."
Hmm.
Then the
Because you know what
second
happened,
sentence,
right?
exactly, yeah. So it so then the second sentence, I kind of remember saying something where it explains why it's outside the test database, because then it says the impact, what was it? The volume of it was 19 cubic centimeters when we've only tested up to 3.
The volume of the ramp is 1,920 cubic inches versus 3 cubic inches for the test.
Wait, so 1,000
Yes,
plus?
920. So
Oh,
effectively, it was 640 times bigger than what they used for the test cases.
wow. Do you have a calculator on your computer or
It's
did
in
you
my
just
notes.
nice. Wow, that is a very big difference. And they
Yes.
probably should have said that. They probably shouldn't have just said, again, it's another fact. They just said, this is what we got in the test, or this is what we got in reality, and this is what the test was tested. But
Mhm.
they don't tell you if that's good or bad. So even if that was the title, I think they still wouldn't have driven it home what happened. Maybe somebody would have picked up on it better, but even then,
Well,
you're not communicating what needs to be done.
well, they do tell you how they feel about it because the title says review of test data indicates conservatism for tile penetration, meaning
Oh,
that it's fine, is what the title is telling you.
wait. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but even that title confused me.
Yeah. If I
Yeah.
handed you a post-it note and I said everything is fine, and then I had a bullet point that said, well, not in the test database,
Yeah.
you would probably take the title and be like, okay, well, Harris told me it was fine, so it's probably going to be fine.
Yeah.
So
I also, yeah, I guess that word conservatism, I don't really know what they mean by that. I mean, like, it's,
it's used in a weird context, I think.
yeah, like that's a word. I'm not the most wordsmithy person, but I feel like I could understand a lot of writing, and
Mhm.
that word I would have to look up. And even then, with the definition, I've never used it in a context, so I wouldn't know what it meant. I wouldn't know what to take away from the sentence right away.
Yeah.
It would be
A better
weird.
way to phrase it would probably be wing will withstand the foam strike based on our test data.
Yeah. So that's probably what they could have changed it to.
Mhm.
And then the width probably will withstand it. They would have to justify that, and that would have put more, possibly would have put more emphasis on that, with people saying, well, yeah, maybe your calculation says it will withstand it, but we should probably look into this. And
Yeah.
I mean, we don't actually know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And I also want to touch on something else you were mentioning, which is the vagueness of it all.
mhm,
They use a lot of phrases like significant. Um, and they
yeah,
don't really actually they use significant 1, 2, 5 times in this slide. And they don't you don't know if it's statistical significance, you don't know if it's
yeah,
gonna be bad. Like it's kind of just a word they threw around like a bunch. And they also like
yeah,
minor variations, and they don't quantify what that means. So there's a lot of
yeah.
room for interpretation, and I'm guessing the
Mhm.
engineers thought this was a pretty damning slide, and the managers were like, "Well, that looks fine to me," right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. That's actually, I'm glad we're talking about this, because I am a doctoral student at Carnegie Mellon University. So I was doing a
humble
TA.
flex.
Well, I just wanted to explain. I was doing a TA, a teaching assistant thing, 2 weeks ago. I lectured a class on executive summaries. And in that class, we talked about when your manager reads something, they probably don't like to read anyways. So you want to make it short and sweet. But also, the information you put in that executive summary has to be very accurate and precise, but not in a confusing way. Like if you're going to say it changed by a lot, well, why? Just put the numbers. Like tell us how much it changed by. But don't, the way that this PowerPoint did it, they gave them information, but it was said in a confusing way, and it wasn't very direct about what had happened. And even
Yep.
saying like 30 cubic centimeters to 2,000 cubic centimeters, they probably could have said how you condensed it, which was 642 times larger than what we had tested. Like that type of information, you need to be specific and clear about what you're trying to say, because management, I mean, people like to say they don't have time, but honestly, I think it's more of just any human reading that is not going to they're not going to get the takeaway, no
Yep.
matter how precise they are, except the person who made it.
Which is probably why they tried to ask them to use military cameras to take photos. And
Right.
I think they realized that, look, you didn't take us as seriously as we should have, and this might
Yeah.
be catastrophic, so let's do something about it. But by then, their fate sealed, and
Right.
yeah.
And
So, but
one last thing I wanted to follow up on was that this idea of what you make kind of determines what you're going to be allowed to do later. Because this is a big thing. Like when you write a proposal for something, whatever you put in that proposal, I mean, I don't think you can stray outside of it usually too much. So in a similar thing like this, what you put in the report will be used against you later. So you want to make sure that you're putting in things in a smart way. And I think it sounds like that's a strategic thing, but also when you communicate poorly, you might put incorrect information, or an opinion that maybe you shouldn't have put in a report. And then, like you just said, they said, well, the report said it was fine, so we're not going to do what you want to do, because it sounds like we don't need to do that. So anything you put in these things can kind of come back to bite you. I think that's an interesting lesson that
mhm,
doesn't come up all the time, but it's something that seems like it's really big in all parts of life.
yes, I agree. And yeah, so after all of this, I said 2 years of investigations happened. And they had a lot of conversations like we just had, kind of dissecting all the reports, looking at all the company structure, looking at the PowerPoints, asking experts to come in. Multiple agencies wrote different reports.
Wow.
NASA's own report concluded, I'm going to read this word for word because it's a pretty damning statement.
Oh,
They
yeah.
said, the board views the endemic use of PowerPoint briefing slides instead of technical papers as an illustration of the problematic methods of technical communication at NASA.
Mm-hmm.
That's a hell of a statement, mostly because they specifically call out PowerPoint by name. I'm not
Yeah.
paraphrasing, I'm not like abbreviating or filling in the gaps. They said that word right
Yeah.
in their own
Did
conclusion.
they do the proper 2 capital P's? Because I
They
think.
did. They
Oh
did.
wow. Did they
This
do
is a
the
NASA
TM?
report, man. They did not do the TM, or maybe they
Okay.
did, and I just didn't
Or maybe
copy
it's
it over
copyright.
correctly.
I don't remember
Yeah.
what. Yeah.
But
Wow.
yeah, which is kind of crazy because you think about like I forgot what they call it, but like when a word becomes uh, like when the brand becomes the adjective or like the verb,
Yes.
like
When
I'm gonna
nobody.
Clorox this.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
Exactly. Nobody says I'm going to give a present. Some people, I'll still say I'll give a presentation, but sometimes they'll just say, "Oh, give a PowerPoint
yeah.
or give a PowerPoint slide presentation or give a something like that,"
Even
even if you don't need it.
even if it's Google Slides, people still call it PowerPoint, right? Where
Oh
they're
yeah,
like,
it's
"Oh,
also
let the
true.
power."
Right. It's like saying, "Give me
Yeah,
a Kleenex instead of a tissue."
exactly, exactly.
Wow. So
Um,
I don't know if you researched this, but why is that? Why is it in schools everywhere? I mean, we can easily say Microsoft paid people got in somehow, but like, how did that come about? When did that start? Is there anything that you have backed up for that?
no, but
Okay.
I can take a guess, and I'm pretty sure the guess is Microsoft offers huge educational discounts, and so their suite is the one
True.
that ends up getting used everywhere, right? And
Yeah.
they're in early. It's like they get those deals in early, and then they just kind of keep on doing it. I
Yeah.
don't think, apart from, well, because I went to engineering schools and stuff, and
Mhm.
so
And
a
stuff.
lot of them, a lot of them are like Windows, just because of compatibility.
Right.
But if you
Right.
go to like a creative school or a creative lab, you'll find nothing but Macs everywhere.
Yeah, that's true.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, they get you started soon, and because it's a lifetime type of tool, it's a
yeah.
tool that you will use not just in school, but when you get out of school and get your desk job somewhere,
Hmm.
and it works with Windows. I mean, there's these other alternatives like LibreOffice, but that's just a mimic of Microsoft products.
Hmm.
So it's not like that would not fix the issue. It's just the idea of using they're all tools and they're made for a certain job, but the idea of like whether it's Microsoft PowerPoint or LibreOffice Presenter or whatever it's called, Showtime,
Yeah,
like that doesn't actually matter. It's just the idea of having this program that forces you to make a slide and has these certain ways that it has you set the slide up and you don't really think about it much. That seems like the issue that it starts you so young and everybody. I don't think they really teach communication skills. I mean they try to a little bit in school, but it's not a focus. It's not. It's kind of. It seems like it's hard to give that practice, especially if kids don't want to do it. Because if you don't want to communicate, nobody can force you.
yeah. I totally agree because I think it's very, especially if you don't want to do it. PowerPoints end up becoming they give you like bullet points. Slide one, talk about this. Slide two, talk about this, and then they kind of just do it and then they leave, and they don't really think about whether they even made an argument or whether they persuaded or informed
Yeah.
correctly. They don't. None of that comes across. I mean, I've seen like college professors use PowerPoints and
Uh,
just be abusing it and using it horribly, and at the end, nobody really learns anything from what is done. So,
yeah. Yeah. It's people will do it because it needs to be done, but they might not think about why they need to get it done or
mhm.
what they're even trying to say with what they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the other problems with PowerPoint is, ironically, what makes a good PowerPoint makes a terrible report. Because
Yeah.
to me, the best PowerPoints are the ones that have kind of like a loose structure in terms of bullet points and not too
Mhm.
much text. And you're instead reliant on the presenter to use those as like the foundation starting point and then explain stuff that's not on the slide. Because if I can get everything I needed off the slide, you wouldn't need the presenter, right? Like you don't
Exactly.
need somebody. A well-written report does not need them to explain it to you. You just read it and you would say, okay, I've gathered these main points, and maybe you have other ideas to build up off of that, but you shouldn't have 4 questions about what's in that report,
Yeah.
right? Uh,
That's a good point because reports are made, they should be written for when you are not there. I mean, that's why writing exists. Authors are dead, but we can still read what they wrote and understand their ideas. But a
correct.
PowerPoint presentation, or I guess I should just say presentation, is something that you should be there because it's all about what you're speaking, your
Mhm.
eloquence, your oration. And yeah, I have a story where my professor, when I was writing my first paper, he said, he asked me a question. It was a very rough draft. It was, I remember reading it over and not understanding what I had wrote. But I didn't read
Mhm.
that. I didn't do that until after he read it. And said, he read me a sentence and said, "What does that mean?" And I went to answer it, and he said, "No, you can't answer the question because if I was reading this in real life, you wouldn't be there. So
Ah.
rewrite it and
Yeah.
make sure that you can understand it before you give it to me again."
Yeah.
So it's one of those things that it's easy to think about. It's easy to make the mistake of when you're writing a report, talking with somebody over the report. But if it's something that's meant to live past you being next to the person, you have to think about it in a different way.
Mhm.
Because it's like in school, your teacher's always there. I mean, they can read it, but after they read it, you can go up to them and talk to them and maybe get an extra couple points. But
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not how it works in the real world most of the
Mhm.
time.
Completely agree. That's a great point that your professor made, though. That's very
Yeah.
it's a good way to teach that point.
It was a little bit harsh, but like it got the point across. It wasn't
Tough
actually harsh.
love. Tough love.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, and to me, the best PowerPoints are the ones that are more like interactive demos, if that makes sense. And the PowerPoint helps keep
Yes.
like a structure, or has some really high level ideas on it, and that which you
Yeah.
explain. And because I do think PowerPoint shouldn't be standalone. I think you can upload slides, but I think you're going to need the presenter to walk you through some of the slides and stuff. Because there's no way you pick it
Yeah.
up from how vague it is. And to kind of
Mhm.
counter my own point about professors misusing it, I've also seen some really good uses of PowerPoints where they'll have their
Mhm.
kind of agenda and high level ideas, and then they will use them to kind of jump off into a point where, it'll be like physics or something, and they'll say, "Oh, this is how you make a free body diagram." So the slide will say free body diagram, and it'll have a few
Mhm.
bullets for what the components are, but just reading the slide won't teach you anything, and you have to
Yeah.
watch him walk through some examples, and once he does that, then you kind of are able to put all of it together and say, "Oh, okay, that makes sense. Now I understand what that
Right.
slide was saying."
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah.
the idea of having a slideshow, I think it's really just sometimes you just need to show pictures, and the easiest way to show a picture, PowerPoint makes it very easy to put pictures on things, but
Mhm.
they don't reinforce that you should be putting pictures because that's a thing that's a conscious choice you have to make. It's very easy to just put words on the slide.
Mhm.
So I like to use PowerPoints as a there's this thing that I want to bring up called assertion evidence model, and that's a way of constructing your PowerPoints. And the way that assertion evidence works, they actually teach this at Carnegie Mellon, and that's where I learned about it. But I think there's a professor at Penn State who is kind of the main person for this. I can't remember his name, but I think he started it. And assertion evidence is a thing where you put the main point as a sentence at the top of the slide, the main takeaway of the slide. So instead of saying, even like you said, free body diagram as the title, maybe it would be something more like you have to draw arrows to
Mhm.
create a free body diagram. Like that's mostly, I think the professor who made it says that's the only text on the slide, but there's a middle ground. You need annotations for things
Uh-huh.
on as like a figure, but that it's minimal text, mostly pictures, because humans, when you're reading, you can't really listen. It's the same thing as when you're speaking, you can't really hear.
Mhm.
And it's a really good. It definitely made me think about when I make my PowerPoints, how hard is it to look at a slide and understand what's going on? And it gets into a nitty gritty thing, but it kind of starts to become like a almost second nature when you can easily just look at something and say, wow, I hate looking at that. And that makes it really easy to go back and start thinking about how can I make it not
Yeah.
yucky.
Yeah.
And then you come up with your own things that make it easier for you to see things and also easier for audience members. So it's that type of idea of you don't have to use that assertion evidence model, but using the idea of just putting more pictures, making pictures the big idea, the big
Mhm.
center point of a slide.
Yeah. And yeah, and just like you said, it ends up being very nitty-gritty, and there's a lot of differing opinions on how to make PowerPoints. And so I've had really good PowerPoint teachers, like our high school teacher. I
Mhm.
don't know if we want to mention him by name, but we had a teacher in
Mr.
high school,
Pritchard.
Mr. Pritchard, who taught, honestly, he taught me a lot of, I think, what leads me to be a successful public speaker today. And basically making really minimal PowerPoints, but also really impactful PowerPoints. So it was a really good starting ground. I remember he kind of went with a tough love approach where he
Mhm.
didn't give the first presentation I ever gave to him. He assigned everybody to give a presentation on some random topic, and then we all showed up, and he didn't give any constraints. He just said, "Give the presentation," and then we gave the presentation, and then he tore us to shreds, and then had us give another presentation like 2 weeks later based on everything we learned. And
Mhm.
what do you know? He has like a bunch of excellent, well-crafted presentations, and honestly, I use a lot of his tips to this day. So it's a very effective teaching
Yeah.
method. But I've also had really bad PowerPoint teachers. And I had an internship at this company
Mm.
once, and they actually, I suspect that they must have had bad presentations in the past from interns. So
Oh, I'm
they
sure. Yeah.
actually hired this company and they sent two people over. And it was kind of like a boot camp for how to give
Mm.
presentations.
Yeah.
And most of their tips were good. I don't want to just bash them completely, but they had two which I think were kind of misses. They were saying that at the end of your PowerPoint, you need to make a plea and a really moving argument for why they should hire you for next year's internship cycle.
Mm.
And they also said if you want to draw attention to yourself, like in a good way,
Mhm.
then as you're talking, turn like the projector off so that it's black. And then the audience just looks at you. And then you can turn it back on and then they'll look back at the slide. And it's a way of like moving the spotlight from the
Mm.
projector to yourself. Right. I thought that
Interesting.
was dumb, so I didn't do the
Difficult to
second
do
part.
that. Yeah.
And I kind of disagreed with a lot of the points they laid out because I felt like it didn't mesh very well with my presentation style. And
Mhm.
ironically, and this is my humble brag, but I ended up winning the award for best presentation from those teachers, which I thought was kind of hilariously
Mhm.
ironic because I really disagreed with them a lot on a lot of stuff and just ended up doing my usual kind of presentation. But that seemed to have been good enough, and I won that award. But anyways,
Congrats, Harris.
thank you.
Congratulations.
I was really fishing for the validation there, and
Yeah.
I got it. So, but
Was that 6 years ago again? How long was that?
I don't remember. It was a long time ago. But now I'm getting the roses I deserve, you know.
Yeah.
But I remember there was this girl who gave the presentation. She like English. She was learning English, and so it was kind of she's getting used to the language and learning how to present and all that kind of stuff. And so she took the teachers very seriously.
Mm.
And I still remember in the final presentation, they bring all the managers and all the directors, and it's like a crowded room. Like there's a lot of people watching you present. And
Yeah.
she goes up there and she's killing it. She's doing a great job. And she's presenting like her first couple slides. And then she follows the instructor and she turns off the projector or goes to like a black
Um,
slide or something. And one of the VPs like pauses her and is like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Like, Gretchen,
yeah.
can we fix the projector? I think something's broken with it."
Oh man.
And then we have to all like kind of awkwardly explain that this is actually like a tactic that you can use to draw attention to yourself. And I could tell they were very confused, but rightfully so, because you wouldn't
Yeah.
expect that in a presentation.
Uh,
I just remember feeling so bad for her because she was doing so great, and then like her pacing and everything kind of got messed up because of the interruption and flow and all that. And kind of the
yeah.
cherry on top was after all the presentations were over, my manager came up to me and he was like, "Why is everyone like begging for a return offer basically at the
Oh
end?"
my God.
He was like, "Why is
Yeah.
everybody just like, please hire me again?" He's like, "I get
Yeah.
it, but also like each and every one of you seems genuinely fearful that we like hate you or something."
Yeah. It's
So like
very. It sounds awkward. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, my point is that there's good and bad PowerPoint teachers, and
Yeah.
so even in the best of cases, you won't always end up with a good PowerPoint for the use case that you're trying to do. So
Yeah. And I think that thing about turning a PowerPoint off, turning off the slide, the
Yeah.
projector to draw attention to yourself. That sounds like one of those quick tip type of tips
Mhm.
where sure if it works for the presentation, you can do that. But it probably won't work for that presentation, and it won't work for everybody, even if it does work for a certain presentation.
Mhm.
Presenting is very personal because you're presenting who you are to a room of people who you may know, but you might not know them.
Yeah.
It's a very different type of communication compared to just talking to somebody.
Mhm.
But yeah, everybody has their own thing, and it's part of presenting, learning to present well, is learning how you present. It's not, you can't mimic somebody's style. Because when you try
Yeah.
to mimic how somebody else does it, you'll ultimately clam up and you probably will be overthinking it. That's happened to me a couple times.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's interesting to hear that tip, and I know I've heard other things like that, like the imagine the audience is in their underwear popular tip. I've never used that. I don't even know if that works, but it's one of those things where it's like you're not really giving me good advice. You're just giving me like a quick tip when the real solution to giving a good presentation is to practice and get comfortable with who you are at the front of the room.
Mm.
Because if you're having a good time up there, then it'll make it easier for the audience to have a good time.
Yep. Totally agree. And I think at least for me, I don't know what works for you. I think my most successful presentations are always telling a story. I think stories, if constructed right and delivered correctly, will be remembered and are really fun to deliver as like a presentation. And it's
Yeah.
not too like distant from like my favorite conversation with friends and family, where it's usually me telling some kind of story that I think is interesting or insightful. And presentations are basically the same, just a little more. There's a certain structure, a certain subject matter, but if possible, I like to tell a story instead of just informing. Because I think the ones where you're just reading numbers or specs off a slide is horribly
Yeah.
boring, and I don't even think the presenter cares at that point, right?
Yeah. So we've talked about presentations are bad, or at least the way that PowerPoint is being shoved down people's throats that caused a very big incident with NASA.
Mhm.
I think our middle portion here was kind of about how you can actually use presentations in a good way and how you can give good
Yes.
presentations and like what's the proper way to use it. But now I think it would be a good transition to go on to where how Amazon, Tesla, how are these big companies doing these
Yes.
things?
Wow, that
And
was a very smooth segue, Nick.
oh, thank you. It seemed like a good
Yeah.
segue.
So right before we get into that, there's a quick point I wanted to make about something I learned, which I thought was pretty cool. It's something called Conway's Law. I don't know if you've already heard of that, Nick.
Oh, yeah, I haven't. Maybe I've heard the law, but I don't know the name Conway's law.
So this is a kind of like a law, like a principle, just like a general thing, and it's
Mhm.
stated in many different ways depending on what source you look at. But
Right.
the one that makes the most sense for this discussion, I'll frame as so. It is the structure of software will mirror the structure of the organization that built it.
Oh,
And
interesting. Yeah.
what they mean by that is, well, there's a lot of different examples, but the
Mhm.
vaguest ones I could find that could have the be applied in the most amount of ways. So like the first one is like if you have a bunch of small distributed teams, you're going to end up with a modular service microservice based architecture. And
Mhm.
if you have like one large team, you'll end up with more of a monolithic architecture
Mhm.
and more of a uh, conglomerate kind of structure, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
And
Yeah.
NASA, from what I could tell, is very hierarchical, and they seem to
Mhm.
be very small, distributed, specialized teams. And so, what this ends up resulting in is information needing to be passed up the chain in a kind of bottom up approach,
Yeah.
right? And anytime you do that, when you go from manager to their manager to their manager,
Mhm.
you are always going to end up with filtering, simplification, and reduction of what the
Yeah.
original information source was, which, from a business point of view, makes sense, right? Because the
Mhm.
director doesn't need to know what Python library you imported to get your stuff working. He just needs to know
Right.
that it works, right?
Yeah.
Now, in this case, in NASA's case, that was catastrophic because you can be reasonably sure that one of the bullet points they just omitted was probably that last one. So maybe
Mhm.
one or two saw it, but it's very likely that nobody really saw the whole
Yeah.
thing. Now, Conway's Law I completely agree with because
Mhm.
Sentinel is a great example. We're not a large team, but because we were doing everything, we ended up with I like the word monolithic. I think we ended up with like a pretty
Yeah.
big one
Monolith,
repository,
unstoppable.
one repository to rule them all kind of thing. And it did it all. It did the Kalman filter, it did the robot and everything. I would describe
Yeah.
my current working job as a more of the first example where it's a lot of
Mhm.
smaller distributed teams and more of a microservice architecture where we're all talking to each other and um,
Mhm.
trying to communicate and use other people's projects to make other
Yeah.
projects and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So
Interesting.
yeah, I just thought that was a really cool way to think about it because I've actually never thought about it before, and it also helps explain why all the information gets omitted from NASA. But
Yeah.
let's
And
dive into.
actually,
Yep, go ahead.
oh yeah, sorry, cutting you off. That I guess I was going to do the segue too. That would make sense why NASA, being very hierarchical, causes a lot of communication. When the communication is poor, it causes things to break down.
Yes.
So your communication, I was going to condense, maybe your communication style will inform how your teams communicate and what type of team structure you have, which informs what you're creating.
Mhm.
Interesting.
But it's
Okay.
difficult balance, right? Because you can't
Yeah.
always have everybody in the same room talking about the same thing. You would never get anything done that way. So in
Yeah.
some sense, you
Mhm.
need this kind of passing of the
Yeah.
chain, hierarchical, but it's tricky because it led to people dying, right? So
Yeah.
clearly, too much stuff is being filtered out or it's not being handled correctly. So
Mhm.
let's
Yeah.
see how other companies do it. So let's start with Amazon because this is a pretty popular example, mostly because Jeff Bezos, the head Amazonite, that's a word, banned PowerPoint. And instead, he uses memos.
Mhm.
So this is kind of, in my eyes, like a middle ground between a full-out technical report that's well fleshed out and something as sparse and minimal as PowerPoint.
Mhm.
His meetings, he summarizes them as I like a crisp document and a messy meeting. So he starts off every meeting with 30 minutes of reading time.
Can I just say that
And
makes me really hungry?
but the word crisp or just the
A
whole
crisp and a messy.
meeting.
I don't know. It's a very good adjectives, Mr.
I
Bezos.
like a messy burger and crisp fries. You know?
Yes, exactly.
um, so yeah, he has everyone 30 minutes of silent reading time to read the memo, and then the rest of the meeting is kind of talking through the questions they have and getting to whatever point that they need to, right? The
Mhm.
reason he has the 30 minutes of reading time is because nobody reads the memo before the meeting. And he's kind of learned that through experience, which I completely agree with him on. If you include a document, I think maybe one person might open it, but no one's really going to read it fully before they get to the meeting.
I
So
struggled
forcing everyone
looking
to
at
do
your
it.
outline before this, and it's like 20, maybe 40 words.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
So,
like, yeah, it's definitely true.
yeah. Uh, yeah. And so the reason he bans PowerPoints is because, in his eyes, and I completely agree with him on this, PowerPoints are meant to persuade, inform, or sell,
Hmm.
not get people to think.
Hmm.
His favorite meetings are the ones where you ask questions where nobody knows the answer, and then you try to wander your way into a solution. And when that happens, you end up getting breakthroughs, and all the other meetings that built up to that meeting are now suddenly meaningful,
Hmm.
which I think is a great viewpoint. And I think it's a good deconstruction of what most meetings end up being,
Yeah,
which is where the joke comes from. This meeting could have been an email, right? Like I think that's
yeah,
genuinely what this is hitting at. Um,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and then go ahead.
I was thinking about it's very true about PowerPoint being a persuasion tool. I think, and about how your audience, you kind of, when you design a PowerPoint, I realize I try and design it so that you don't have to make them think because as soon as they're thinking, like you don't want them to think in a bad way where they're like trying to understand. You want them to save their brain power to understand what you're saying
Hmm.
because they're learning it as fast as you're saying it, and sometimes that with a lot of information that can be pretty fast. So it causes them to focus most of their brain power on listening to you, not on thinking for themselves. Because as soon as in a presentation, I start thinking for myself, I realize I'm off track with the person who's talking, and
Yeah.
I've missed a lot. So it's a very difficult. It brings your group together to one person, but it doesn't let them think for themselves, and it doesn't start a good conversation. It's great for informing people on high level concepts.
Yes.
So
And I mean,
I just want
I
to
would
add that
most
part. It's great for informing, but yeah, it doesn't make people think.
exactly. And I think that's where PowerPoint shines, right? Like going
Mhm.
back to the demo example, like that's what it's really meant for.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're not going to put up a bullet point and start a really deep discussion in the room because, yeah, that'll be tricky.
yeah,
And yeah, he also goes on to say that PowerPoint is easy for the author and hard for the audience. Um,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, a good 6-page memo, which is his preferred memo length, can take 2 weeks to write because there's a lot of writing, editing, rewriting, because you have to make sure that all of the easy questions are kind of answered in your memo and is written in a thoughtful way. It's kind of what you were getting at with your paper and your professor, where he was like,
Yeah.
if you weren't here, this should be able to stand up on its own.
Hmm.
Um, and then Bezos goes on to say that in PowerPoint, you can hide behind sloppy bullet points and smooth talk your ways out of problems. I think is a really good way of putting it, where yeah, if you have an incorrect bullet point and somebody stops you, then you can kind of defend yourself and kind of talk your way out of it, right? But you can't do that in a memo, and you can't do that in a paper, and you can't do that in a report.
Yeah.
Whatever you wrote is going to be there forever, right?
Yeah. Definitely in teaching, the best way to learn what your students know is to have them write about it. Because if they can't write more than 3 sentences about some topic, then they probably don't know what they're talking about. And
Yeah.
it's very easy to show. Like a multiple choice, 75% or 25% of the time, you'll probably get it right, even though you had no idea what the actual answer was. But as
Mhm.
soon as you have to synthesize information and tell people what's happening, it's not going to work.
Yep. And the last point he makes is in PowerPoint, you can be interrupted halfway through, even though the answer might be on the next slide, which wastes critical presentation time
Hmm.
and derails the meeting usually. And that's what the memo is for, so that everybody reads all the way to the end. And so
Yeah.
I think he says like he scribbles in the margins, like he'll write a question down and then cross it out because it got answered like in the next paragraph and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And I've actually experienced this a lot where it's like I structure my PowerPoint again in the first principles way where I'm like, this is
Hmm.
what we know, this is what I want to do. So how do we get from A to B? And I'll slowly build my way up to get to that point. But then as you're in the middle of building up to it, someone's going to be like, wait, you can't do that, or that doesn't make sense. And then you have to kind of say, wait, can you wait a slide? Or you'll just be like, wait,
Yeah.
wait, I'm working on it. Or you haven't thought about it. In the worst case, you haven't thought about it, and now you're screwed because one of your
Hmm.
fundamental assumptions is wrong.
Yeah. And then
So,
you can't. The worst thing as a presenter is to admit. People say don't say sorry to the audience because you want to keep your confidence up there. And if you do something wrong, it's like a sin to say that oh yeah, you're right, I'm wrong.
mhm,
And which is kind of a bad thing. But yeah, if you're trying to present a thing, you're trying to convince people exactly like what Jeff said. You're trying to convince people about what you're talking about, probably. So the worst thing is for somebody to point out a flaw, and then you are kind of forced to back it up no matter what's actually true.
mhm. But yeah, that's Jeff's opinions on PowerPoint. And
Interesting.
I think he's right. I also think he's targeting a very specific kind of meeting, which he likely has all the time because he's a
Hmm.
CEO. But
Yeah.
I don't think it's like it works for every single solution. Like I'm sure his sales staff goes out there with PowerPoints and they've got
Hmm.
all the AWS services on there. In fact, I've been pitched AWS services on a PowerPoint slide. So I know for a fact
Yeah.
it's used in sales or something. But yeah, I thought it's a good way to make sure your meetings are actually useful because I've definitely been in meetings where I'm like, this is just a waste of time. We could have accomplished a lot more in the time where you dragged us in here and read us some bullet points, you know?
Yeah, and the big question I have is, hey, how do we implement this in our own day-to-day lives if you have meetings? I mean, I'm thinking of with my advisors, I couldn't think of forcing them to read a document because it doesn't seem like it's always worth the time. Sometimes it's better to just have a slide with the things that we're going to talk about, and it's like topic 1, let's talk about this. You don't need to write
Well,
a whole paragraph about it. But sometimes we do have a document and go over it. But it depends on what we're talking about.
the answer to that question is easy. Just become the CEO, and then whatever you do, people have to follow because you're the CEO.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, but I think so. This is a good chance to go back to Sentinel for a second because we did exclusively PowerPoint slides for all of our check-ins and
Hmm.
for all of our meetings with Austin. I think we just did PowerPoint slides and kind of went over what we had, what we didn't have.
Hmm.
And I would actually argue it worked really well there because it allowed us to condense everything we had into a couple slides. If we had written that as a memo, I don't think he would have read it, honestly. And even if we were in
Oh yeah.
person, sitting down with him with a printed copy of the memo, I feel like he still wouldn't read it fully, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. There'd be some performance anxiety, like, oh man, I got to read this like in an hour. I've got to get
Yeah.
it done. Yeah, like you might not be skimming it, or you might not be
Mhm.
reading it as well. And I think it
Yeah.
is in the scenario I'm thinking of with Jeff. I have a feeling it's a little bit more stressful than a weekly meeting with your group
Mhm.
because I mean they probably are friends in Amazon, the people in that
Mhm.
meeting, but it might be a meeting of like I don't know 20 people. Did he say how many there were?
No.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's larger than 5 people, and they're not all working together at the same time, which is why it's a
Yeah.
meeting. They don't know what each other's doing.
Mhm.
So then a PowerPoint, you're put in the position of convincing people. But if
Yep.
you're in a group of people that you know and you talk to all the time, you're not really trying to convince them, you're just talking. And the
Mhm.
PowerPoint acts as a good way to just be the, like you said before, the structure to the meeting or the structure to a
Mhm.
discussion. But the discussion can still be messy. So I agree. I think a PowerPoint or a slideshow can just be a very good backbone to your meeting.
Yeah. Now, if you take his approach and you apply it to the Columbia problem, they launch, they realize that a piece of foam hit the wing. Is it a problem or not? In his approach, they would have a meeting and they'd have memos distributed, like 6-page memos, and they would all read through it and then discuss it. And I've got to hand it to him. I think in that approach, I think they would have caught it and gotten those astronauts
Yeah.
back home alive.
Yeah, with a bigger meeting like that, where if you're only talking about one problem and you have a memo that goes through the problem, it would really help. But I get the sense that that report also had other things they talked about, right?
Hmm.
So maybe it would have been the flight, the takeoff thing, and in it one of the sections would have been this thing. And with the 6 pages, you can easily write 30 pages on everything. Like engineers love to keep giving
Yeah.
details. That forces you to get it to what's important and think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, and also one point he makes is that a good 6-page memo can take 2 weeks to write, and two
Mhm.
weeks was the length of the entire mission. So if it does take you 2 weeks to write that memo, the mission would have been over and you would have been screwed anyways. But I also think they would
Yeah.
have, you know,
Well,
written one a lot quicker.
a mediocre memo would have sufficed, maybe,
Yep,
just not a bad one.
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how Amazon would handle it, and or
Okay.
how they handle that kind of communication.
Interesting. Do you
And
have any other things?
I want to switch the dial
Hmm.
to a completely different company, Tesla, specifically Mr. Elon Musk himself, who's a
Oh,
very contentious personality, but we're going to
Mr.
ignore
Musk.
that.
Yeah.
um, and yeah, I want to read to you parts of an email that he sent internally, uh, because I think
Mm.
it touches on a lot of the ideas that we talked about. And uh, companies always say they value transparency and honesty, and at some
Hmm.
companies that can be true, and other ones it's mostly false.
Right.
But he sent this email.
So was
I
this
thought was
posted on Twitter/X?
no, I think some employee leaked it, and then a
Okay.
lot of news outlets picked it up, which is usually how most emails get distributed
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
Tesla internal. But yeah,
Mhm.
so he says there are two schools of thought about how information should flow within companies. By far, the most common way is chain of command, which means that you always flow communication through your manager. The problem with this approach is that while it serves to enhance the power of the manager, it fails to serve the company. Instead of a problem being solved quickly, where one person in one department talks to a person in another department and makes the right thing happen, people are forced to talk to their manager, talk to their manager, who talks to their manager in the other department, who talks to someone on his team. Then the information has to flow back the other way. This is incredibly dumb. Any manager who allows this to happen, let alone encourages it, will soon find themselves working at another company. No kidding. Anyone at Tesla can and should email and talk to anyone else, according to what they think is the fastest way to solve a problem for the benefit of the whole company. You can talk to your manager's manager without his permission. You can talk directly to a VP. You can talk to me. You can talk to anyone without anyone else's permission. You should consider yourself obligated to do so until the right thing happens. The point here is not to make random chit chat, but to ensure that we can execute ultra fast and well. We obviously cannot compete with the big car companies in size, so we must compete with intelligence and agility.
Mm.
The final point is that managers should work hard to ensure they are not creating silos within the company that create an us versus them mentality or impede communication in any way. This is unfortunately a natural tendency and needs to be fought. How can it possibly help Tesla for departments to erect barriers between themselves or see their success as relative within the company instead of the collective? We are all in the same boat. Thanks, Elon.
Interesting. So why was that leaked? That didn't sound so bad.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he goes out of his way to publish his internal email, so yeah.
Exactly. So what happened? Why do you? I'm just curious first why that was leaked because I didn't see much bad with that. It seemed a little bit aggressive. You are basically forced to talk to other people. Like you are consider obliged that you are obliged to do so to talk outside of your group. But
Yeah. I don't know. It just says it's a copy of a unpublished email, previously unpublished email. Or maybe it was published at some point. I don't know.
mm, mm, yeah, well, I
But
like
yeah,
it.
I'm a huge fan. I also miss that kind of Elon, Like I miss the old Elon. Like I think
Yeah,
there
he
was a time where he
actually.
had some pretty solid takes.
Yeah, I mean, he sounded. I mean, the email was well written. It sounded like he was talking about stuff in a good way. Yeah, good job to Elon. Like I could see him in the public eye, he's got some stuff, weird stuff, but like as an actual teammate, at least in from that specific email, sounded like he has the power to say things. I would get the sense powerfully and get the
Yep.
point across succinctly. I have heard other bad things about how he will go to like some engineer who caused a problem and like yell at them.
hmm
And
hmm
that's really sad. That's not correct and he shouldn't do that. It's unprofessional. But yeah, I like the idea of it's interesting like that all almost gets to this monolithic thing that you're saying where or maybe it gets around it where you have teams that work internally, but then you have some cross communication between teams that aren't through the managers that might help blend the edges between these
hmm
different teams.
Yep. Yeah. No, it's hard. Like it's one of those things where it's like ideally good, but it becomes really hard. And I actually think this principle scales very poorly because
Yeah.
I think the only reason this even remotely stands a chance at working at Tesla is because of the point he made at the end, where we can't compete with them in size, so we do it with intelligence. What he really means is our company is small enough that there's no reason for this hierarchical nonsense. But
Mhm.
yeah, I just don't see how it just becomes as big as like a company like Ford, and they're still able to do this because
Yeah.
uh yeah, I don't know, this could get out of hand very, very quickly. Um
Yeah. So why do you say that? What specifically do you have an example where you're envisioning it going off the rails? Paint us a
so
picture.
I guess like if someone or many someones just start talking to whoever they want, that might be good in the short term, but
Mm.
now you have a communication mismatch where some people have more knowledge than others, and
Yeah.
that might be bad, right? And like, it could
Managers
also,
sometimes do need to know what
yeah,
they need to know certain things, and if you're going past everybody to get to the other team, you might be setting up projects without any manager knowing,
yes,
and they're like, "Wait, why are you putting time towards this project?" And they're like, "Well, this guy said I needed to help him." And we're like, "No,
Mhm.
no, no, you can't do that." But I didn't know about that, so now like a whole week of work is gone. Yeah,
And there's a lot of lost accountability in that kind of thing because this is
yeah.
more startup mentality where it's just keep burning the midnight oil until we
Mhm.
get to our minimum viable product, which
Yeah,
works until you get to the MVP, right? And the moment you try to scale it up even further and make more things, you're going to struggle. And I think
yeah,
that's kind of what we're seeing with them struggling with Cybertruck and kind of
yeah,
struggling to get new projects off the ground and that kind of stuff. And I mean, it's no surprise that their stuff keeps getting delayed because you can't
mhm.
keep. I'm not saying this email is bad or anything. I like the idea a lot, but I think applying this practically can be very difficult and can go off the rails pretty quickly. Um,
Yeah, I have heard a lot of problems with their recent Cybertruck. So,
yeah,
and I'm sure there's some communication in that with all their delays, and also just they also do have a very startup mentality with the way that their cars are, how the customer interacts with the company with
hmm,
updates over the air. You need to go in to get like a version of a car. They don't really have model years, I think.
yep,
It's an interesting change, but going back to what we said about the communication style informs how the product will look ultimately.
hmm,
That seems like what's happening here, where there's a lot of different things happening. It's very fast paced, so their product changes all the time. Is hard to keep up with, hard to keep an eye on. Like, oh,
exactly.
what version do you have? I don't know. I'm like 3 versions behind. I don't even know what my car does anymore. Like it's very it does make it a little bit less harder to pin down and harder to keep a very high quality product possibly.
Yeah, this wasn't part of the research I did for this podcast, but there's a story I read where Elon was looking at the Cybertruck prototype, and he looks at the floor, and he sees this floor mat. He's like, "What is this floor mat for?" And
The
someone
floor
tells him
the truck is under it, or the floor mat in the truck?
like in the truck,
Okay.
like in the
Okay.
seat. Yeah,
Okay.
and someone's like, "Oh, what is this?" Or Elon says, "What is this for?" And someone says, "It's for some heat dissipation." He's like, "What?" And then he asks somebody else, and they say, "I thought it was for vibration dampening because like the bottom vibrates too much or something." And he's
Yeah.
like, Elon goes, "We fixed this last week. It doesn't vibrate as much anymore." And so he takes off the mat and he goes to the guy who made the mat and he says, "Why'd you make this?" And then the guy said, "I thought we needed it for the vibration nonsense." And then
Yeah.
Elon was like, "Yeah, we don't need this anymore." And he just like dumps it on the floor and goes back to the truck. And that to me is the epitome of all the problems of running a team this way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and
he-
that must have been a whole week. He had to get that thing manufactured from somebody, and
yeah,
yeah, and that was a waste of. Yeah, it's not just like, oh man, that sucks. He didn't like what I did. Like it was a total waste because
yep,
everything, all the work you put into it, is now no longer in the product. So
exactly.
yeah, it could have been diverted somewhere else. So I actually like what I don't know if you thought about this, but I like what we did with the Amazon thing. How do you think the Tesla form of communication would have changed the shuttle incident? So let's say they did communicate like Tesla and they
Yeah.
had this video. How do you think that would have gone?
So, I mean, they wouldn't have been rejected by whatever manager they asked, right? Like they could just go straight to like the VP or to the president or whoever.
Or
Um,
they might have just called, I don't know if they could have gone to the military directly, but maybe somebody would have even started being like, well, let's just call the army, see what they got. Just call the guy
yeah,
who has the cameras. Yeah.
yeah. But there's an interesting contrast there, and I had this as one of the points I wanted to bring up. Where so NASA, federal company division thing,
Mhm.
they're under a
Wait.
lot of
So,
scrutiny.
so NASA is not a branch of the government or anything like that, right? That you said they're a company, so they're technically
They're not
like
a
not
uh,
a branch of government, obviously,
Now
But
we're getting into the legalese part of the
yeah, but I just mean
podcast.
like they are not the army. They don't have any jurisdiction like that. They are a company that is
Independent
hired.
agency of the U.S. federal government.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But because of that, because they're under the government, federal government, they are under a lot of scrutiny, and they have
Mhm.
to be
True.
very careful about what they do, how they do it, passing safety checks. And you'll notice a number I said 2 years. The whole shuttle program was shut down for 2 years
So that
after
did NASA
Columbia.
do anything in that time, or were they just doing other things like whatever was going on in the moon? And
I don't know actually, but as far as the space shuttle was concerned, it wasn't grounded and didn't do anything.
yeah.
And they did a lot of investigations and that kind of stuff, and they're held to a high level of scrutiny. And because it's the government, their budgets are always delayed or smaller than they
Oh yeah.
wanted, and
Mhm.
that can be really tricky, right? Now, since you brought up Elon, I want to contrast that with SpaceX because
Mhm.
SpaceX is a privately owned company, and Elon can do whatever he
And
wants. Right?
SpaceX is one of Elon Musk's other companies that's
Correct.
building. They're basically
Yeah.
transplacing NASA, where they're trying to make these space shuttles. Correct.
Kind of. So there's the lines are a little bit different because
Mhm.
NASA's whole thing is about space research and the space program, right? But SpaceX's entire thing is about building rockets so that they can colonize Mars. That is literally their mission statement, right?
Yeah.
Now, they've had some interesting asides, like Starlink, you might have heard, where they have the fleet
Mhm.
of LEO constellation satellites, and they're able to provide internet from the
Mhm.
satellite at the low Earth orbit, which is pretty cool. Like, I like that one a lot, and it
Right.
provides internet to like rural areas where it would be hard to get like a cell tower out there and that kind of stuff. Um, so
Yeah.
they do stuff like that, but their main goal, which is what their Starship is about getting people to Mars, right?
Mhm.
And because they're private, they can basically take Elon's money and whatever investor money they have and burn it to basically get in space as fast as possible, right? And this is how they did their self-landing rocket booster. I don't know if you've already seen this or not, but um,
I've we could explain it because I'm not very familiar.
so rocket bodies are one of the most like expensive parts of any like rocket and shuttle,
Mhm.
and NASA's done good work. Columbia is actually the space shuttle is partially reusable, right? So when it
Mhm.
comes back, it lands and they can reuse the shuttle for another mission.
Mhm. It has to
Um,
land in water, or how does that work?
no, it
How do these
lands like a
space shuttles
plane
land?
does.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But like for a rocket, you can't really land that. So usually when you launch it,
Mhm.
you lose it. So instead,
Right.
SpaceX is like, this is a huge amount of money. What if we just like landed the rocket back on the launch pad after its mission? And it
Oh,
took
yeah.
them a lot of money and a lot of tries to get it to work, but they were able to get it to work. And there's a compilation online of like all the failed launches they did.
Mhm.
And it was kind of inspiring where it's like, oh, you can fail, kind of tying with the theme of this podcast, you can fail a million times, but you just have to succeed once, right? And then it
Yeah.
works. And that's what they're doing using to this day. And I remember they interviewed this NASA guy, and he's pretty high up the chain of command. And he said, yeah, SpaceX's work is tremendous, but if we lost rockets at the rate they did, the government would close us tomorrow and they would stop funding us.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty stark and kind of tragic uh, viewpoint, but I totally understand what he's saying and where he's coming from because they can
Mhm.
do whatever they want, right? And they'll be fine because it's a private company. But because of the scrutiny and safety and all that, NASA cannot progress nearly as fast. And the
Right.
greatest irony is that NASA now collaborates a lot with SpaceX, and
Mhm.
um, they get their rocket bodies from SpaceX. So a lot of the launches to the space station will actually use a SpaceX rocket to get there and get
Interesting.
humans there and get supplies there and that kind of thing. And yeah, so it's an interesting kind of symbiotic relationship. And NASA kind of has to do it because it'd be too expensive for them to make it on their own. So they just work with SpaceX and get it like a discounted rate.
Yeah.
But just like Boeing had problems with their contractors. If SpaceX screws up, NASA might be held back even further. Um,
Yeah, this
so
happens a
yeah,
lot when you try to pay somebody else to do work. It could
yes.
be good in the meantime, but if something goes wrong with it, you have no control over
Mhm.
fixing that problem. Yeah,
So
so
yeah,
I guess
and
oh, go ahead.
to go back to the original question,
Mhm.
yes, that is a way they could have solved it, but would it be good for NASA as a whole to start doing stuff the way Tesla does stuff? I don't think so.
Interesting.
I feel like they would have had like 10 Columbias had they kind of gone. I mean, you can kind of see it
Yeah.
in the way the Cybertruck was made, right? Like there's quality issues, and you can't have that. When something as small as a piece of foam hitting a wing can be catastrophic, that
Yeah.
just does not fly, right? No pun intended.
Good
Yeah.
one. Um, I also wanted to ask, is it also they're just in different conditions? Because, I mean, I don't know, did NASA ever really think about unmanned missions before? Like, it seemed like a lot of the tragedies that they had were manned space missions where they had astronauts inside. But is SpaceX even really doing launches with people? Or are they just
Yes.
launching? Oh, okay. I mean,
They're
that's the
doing.
plan, of course, but have they done any with people so far?
They did, or they're going to do one, I think, soon. Or they did one. I don't
Hmm.
remember. But yes, they are working to get humans there. But they've started off with just
Right.
nobody, and just having like a fully automated like shuttle and stuff. But they're gonna get there
Yeah.
one day. I mean, Blue Origin did that stupid flyover. I don't know if you saw this, but these
With
little
Jeff
William
Bezos
Shatner
and
and Jeff
William
Bezos.
Shatner.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Blue
they're trying
Origin is
to
owned by Amazon, right?
correct.
Okay.
Um, yeah, and they're not. I'm sure they're making progress, but
Hmm.
I don't know. SpaceX seems to be killing it so far.
Yeah. It seems like I've heard a lot more about them.
Yeah.
There's also, oh, never mind. There's this other space company that's using metal 3D printing, and I can't remember what, I think it's called Relativity or something, but
Okay.
they might be a smaller player in the game comparatively.
Hmm, interesting. But
Yeah.
yeah, if you were in charge of the Columbia mission and you had a full reign over like how the teams are assembled
Oh.
and yeah, structure and all that stuff, how would you do it?
So the Columbia mission, my engineers, that's the question. Like, how would I
Yeah.
communicate with them? Hmm.
Yeah, you can have what like imagine like you're free reign to hire as many managers, engineers, directors, like whatever. Like whatever
Yeah.
you want. Yeah.
Yeah. Based on our conversation, let's see. This is a difficult problem because it's a lot about it's not just like the what we just talked about was how we communicate and how companies kind of what their overarching motif is on how people should communicate within the company. But
Mhm.
then there's the aspect of what people do you actually put in those positions and how are they going to act and what's the culture going to be. So I'll ignore all those very delicate things and just going to think if I was going to have them communicate, if this is a very big organization, you have to answer to people.
Yeah.
I feel like at the lower, I feel like I would do some stratified approach. Stratified meaning there's like sharp layers, but in between those sharp layers of the hierarchy, it's mixed.
Mhm.
Where I feel like if you're a vice president and then there's a person below you and there's a person below them, like after a certain point, like why is there so much? There shouldn't be a delineation. So the upper management and maybe even just all management, it could be like how Elon Musk is saying, where it's more mixy, where you can just talk to anybody, get things done. But if you're at the lower levels, where you're like the tendrils of the company doing the bare bones work of like how many nuts should be on this spaceship, like you might not need to necessarily talk to other people that are like working on the thrusters or whatever.
Mhm.
Now, there could be situations where that arises, so I feel like in that situation we would need to make sure that the management can be quick because the problem was manager to manager to manager to manager, like this
Yeah.
weird loop that has to go back and forth. Where really, I don't think management, in theory, as a person who's never managed people, I don't know if you really would need to do that. I wonder if it would be easier just to have management be very intermixed to a certain point.
Hmm.
And depending on the size of your company, you can have different levels, like maybe upper management is mixed, but then lower management is mixed, but you don't want, there still needs to be some interconnection,
Yeah.
some layer. So I feel like that might help get around the problem that Elon was trying to fix. And I really do like, I was going to call him Professor Bezos. I like Professor Bezos's approach to using
Meetings.
these meetings in specific meetings where if we have a very mixed management pool, like I'm saying, that those weekly meetings, or maybe we can make them bi-weekly, however often these big things are happening, where you have the management team sit down, talk about an issue, get the problems out, and then they go back to their teams. I think that's also a good approach. But for meetings between a single manager and their team, maybe it's not necessary to do that. Maybe more
Hmm.
it's okay for that manager to just be very informal, the way that you and I have been on projects. And the way that I'm with my advisors, it's a little bit more informal. So I think maybe the takeaway is that creating a culture where there's structure, but you want it to be free flowing enough so that you can quickly respond to things. And the exact specifics of the structure would change because NASA, if I was a guy at NASA, it would probably be, they would force you to be a little bit more rigid.
Hmm.
But I really appreciate all the things that um, Elon Musk has said about communication. So does Jeff Bezos. So they both have some pretty interesting points. But
Yep.
I think the big thing that I would say is they don't apply everywhere. You have to
Hmm.
use them intelligently. They're tools in a toolbox of how can you get your team to work. And those are my thoughts on it. What do you think?
I agree with everything you said, and I want to steal your answer. No, I think
Like,
that's good enough for me. No, but
yeah, yeah. How would you do it in relation to my answer? Do you have a
I
different
think,
idea?
yeah, maybe something unpopular opinion. I actually do think a hierarchical structure works really well for a company like NASA because they're juggling
Hmm.
much more like scrutiny, a smaller budget, and
Yeah.
they're trying to accomplish this crazy mission, right?
Hmm.
And so in that sense, hierarchical structure does make sense, and it helps you filter out the information and only get the relevant parts to where it needs to be, like peak efficiency, right? But I
Yeah.
think where they went wrong is by allowing that hierarchy to become like a shackle for the organization. Because it
Mhm.
sounds like when the engineers got shut down by some lower level manager, that was the end of the conversation, right?
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, I
That
don't I'm
that's what Musk said. That gives managers a lot of power. Like the person
yeah.
who said no had, in that one moment, the situation changed where, he's just the manager, but now he's the thing blocking it.
Mhm.
There's an interesting point I actually want to bring up on this. There's this book that I think everybody should read. It's a little bit dense, but it's called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Okay.
And it's a philosophy book. It's an inquiry into values
Okay.
from the 80s. But an idea is, let's say you're trying to fix a motorcycle and you just want to get in there and change out like a valve or something just because you want to check the inside of the engine. But then you noticed one of the nuts is stripped to get into the engine.
Mhm.
And maybe your engine doesn't work and you really need to open it up. Well, at first you were thinking about, oh, what am I going to do when I get the engine open? But now you've got this nut that you just can't get off. And it's really easy to get stuck on getting frustrated because you're thinking, I can't do the thing I want to do, which is fix the engine because this nut is blocking me. But the idea is that one nut is now worth the entire value of the engine because if you can't get that nut off, the whole engine is worthless. So now
Mm.
what you wanted to fix down the line is not as the most important thing. You don't need to worry about that anymore. You need to worry about the nut that's stopping you from opening the engine so you can do the next step. In the NASA thing, this manager is that nut. He was stopping the whole thing from getting off the ground, possibly. And there's also, as we said, there's a lot of other things. But that idea is really interesting because you have to reframe your mindset when problems arise. When something changes, like sticking to hierarchy is good for the day to day, but for this, where it seemed like people's lives could have been at stake, it might have been a good case to say, hey, I might, for that manager to think, I might have a little bit too much power. I should talk to people about this instead of just saying, I don't want to worry about that.
Yep.
So I wanted to bring that up because it was an interesting idea. I thought it kind of applied here.
It's a funny way to roast the guy, sure.
Yeah.
But I also think that I kind of want to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he wasn't
he's not
like
evil.
Yeah, it was more like I looked at the report, the PowerPoint slide, and we already concluded it's not a problem. So why are we wasting money on this? Because we already broke, right?
And maybe the
But
engineers
also,
couldn't communicate further.
exactly. That's the key, I think, where it's like, forget about the PowerPoint. Yes, the PowerPoint was bad, but if all it takes to kill 7 astronauts is one bad PowerPoint, you've got larger issues at hand, right? Like that should not have been the main thing that brought down everything. And there should have been a better way to escalate and move that forward and get more people involved.
Yeah.
It just got shut down too early, and as a result, people died. So, and I think pointing the finger at PowerPoint, it's a good place to start, but I also think it's the wrong victim. Yes, it was a symptom, but it wasn't the thing that caused everything that led to the death of the 7 astronauts.
Well, ultimately, people create the systems that we live in, so we can change those systems. And I think we talked about that today. It's not just about the tool that you use to communicate, with which you use to communicate, but it's also the systems that you build in your company. I mean, Elon Musk's thing was really more of a system, like talk to anybody. So I think, and that's kind of what we've gotten to, is it's not just one thing, it's a lot of things that come together, and it's about how you think about things. And I really want to make that nut analogy work, so I'd also transfer it to saying that communication could be the nut sometimes that engineers don't like to focus on, because they just want to focus on the thing they're trying to build. They don't want to have to think about, how am I going to convince this one person to do the thing that I need to do? Because it's hard to communicate well when you haven't practiced it, but sometimes the nut that you have to work on is figuring out how to communicate. Have I hammered it home yet?
I get it. But you really ran with that. Well done.
Thank you.
But yeah, no, that all makes sense. But
yeah.
So I mean, that's why the theme of today was how bad communication can be dangerous, not why PowerPoint kills. And a lot of when you research the story, a lot of the headlines are like death by PowerPoint, or their conclusion will be, think about your next PowerPoint because it might kill 7 people. And I'm kind of like, but also I think you missed the point of what actually happened and what led to a PowerPoint slide leading to the death of everybody, so so I think there's one takeaway from the day, apart from all the nut stuff that Nick was saying. I think just being really conscious of communication and how it's being done. So I really think if everybody communicated consciously, then we'd be in a much better spot.
Yeah. And there's a lot behind why that is, but I think we're near a good ending point.
Yes.
Any other closing comments, Harris?
No, just don't blame PowerPoint. Blame yourselves.
You're the problem.
You're the problem.
And it's true. A lot of things can cause a bad presentation.
PowerPoints don't kill people. People with PowerPoints kill people.
People with PowerPoints kill people. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, just think very carefully about how you communicate, because a failure to communicate might mean a failure to keep people alive.
That's a good ending note.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the end for today. Our podcast name is Failing Forward, where our motto is learn to fail and you'll finally succeed. Today we talked about communication, the Columbia Space Shuttle failure, and also how Amazon and Tesla communicate. And we also kind of talked a little bit about how we think we should have restructured NASA if we were in their shoes. Join us next week for a topic that we will figure out soon, but I assure you it will be just as interesting as the one we talked about today and last 2 weeks ago. Thank you. My name is Nick, and my co-host is Harris. You can say goodbye, Harris.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for listening.